do I have the book? Yeah, the Untimely. This is my last book, the Untimely Moderns. It's really a kind of a group portrait of the Yale kind of scene of the period kind of from early 20s till about early 70s. And I mean the influence is a problematic term. Actually, the only place it really I actually talk about influence with that word is when I talk about Harold Bloom and the idea of anxiety of influence and this idea of the greatness that it goes hand in hand with the ability to engage influence, to battle with the predecessors. So this idea of that also creativity, I mean that was of course kind of psychoanalytical Nietzschean take, but this idea that revisiting predecessors is part of a kind of organic and should be an organic part of the creative process is very at the heart of this. So I talk with people that some of them there was this guy called Van Wyck Brooks who was a literary scholar kind of writing in the late teens who coined this term usable past. The title of the book is of course the 20th century architecture reimagined the past. So he talked about the usable past that we again talking about creative process mostly through writers. He was talking about how a writer, a creative person uses the past kind of operatively, and then of course maybe the more well known is T.S. Eliot, the famous essay tradition. So I talk about that. I mean these were really kind of seminal pieces. But then also the influence in the context of this book, it's not limited to architects. I talk about this quite a unique intellectual climate that where at Yale during that period where architects, historians, art historians, architectural historians, philosophers, artists kind of engaged in this conversation. So some of the people I talk about actually Kahn in the context of a very influential philosopher called Paul Weiss, who actually, architects rip off people all right and left, but he kind of took from Paul Weiss the idea of the presence of the past, Paul Weiss, I quote him, he talked about, what has been will always be. I mean, this type of talk, very kind of aphoristic. So I talk about those sort of, I pair architects in conversation with people. I talk about Eero Saarinen, who was also a product of Yale, in dialogue with his classmate George Kubler. So this sort of idea that it's basically kind of art historical formalism also, which kind of posits that art is not, architecture and art are not kind of unmoored from historical time, which enables forms from the past to migrate, into the past. So that's kind of the heart of the kind of intellectual context. But this sort of idea that even modern architect, we always think that this innovation and looking, that this engagement with the past is part of the creative process, and part of, I talk about Joseph and Annie Albers. Annie Albers talked about,
And why did you talk about Joseph Albers?
Because he taught here, but he also talked about, actually Annie.
But they taught in the art department?
Well, it was all kind of it was all one at that time. We didn't the School of Architecture doesn't exist until 1965. So there was a thing called Division of the Art. So everybody took classes with him. But I talk about Annie, who talked about you have to go to the beginnings. She was a major collector of ancient textiles. Actually, both of them, they collected artifacts from the Mesoamerica and really believed that, you have to study the medium that you operate in, through this sort of historical lens by studying the kind of fundamental principles. So the influence, it's really in my work, it really is a kind of, I present this as a kind of core, we've kind of forgotten it, but really these key modern artists, architects, they really talked a lot about how and why would a modern artist or architect engage the past, and they really believed that that's really it's like, eating, your meal. It's like daily bread, It's not like it's not something strange, and it's not something certainly that postmoderns invented, but it was really a fundamental.
But would you say in modernism it was more of a rejection of?
No, we think of these labels. I think they are totally useless. Useless in sense of modernism. That they even people that we consider ultra-modernist, or art theorists like Clement Greenberg, said there's no difference between modern art, contemporary art, and they used also the word contemporary, like produced in 20th century, and Renaissance, They said there's nothing difference, The problems are the same, even the media are the same. Henry Fosilian put it beautifully. He said that every artist inherits both the problems and solutions from the predecessors, There's kind of medium-specific problems, like what Clement Greenberg, and they will be brought forward. Of course, every generation contributes something, but it's kind of like how scholarship work. You always, you don't start from scratch. You build upon those that came before. So it's not like, I think those labels, kind of stylistic labels, and this sort of idea of linear chronologies are totally, they are very misleading, and it's not what happened on the ground, every art, you are creative, you study the work of the predecessors, everybody has done it,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think somehow that that's very much, that was the start, the basis of my research, was realizing that architects have I would say a bit more, a healthier relationship to predecessors or influence than, let's say, artists. Artists are always, in some way, I think, a bit more concentrated on trying to be the first ones. But I think artists...
I don't think so. I think that's a misrepresentation again. Every artist go to museum and study their work. I talk in the... my kind of pool, my archive is really Yale. And it was also interesting because we have one of the first, I think, after Harvard, the second university art museum. And the whole point, to put them near, where the artists had their studios, was that the artist, whoever an architect, could just walk over next door, visit the stuff. Artists, you can't be. You can't, like, I agree with Harold Bloom. You are nobody if you don't know the work. And if you look at even today, any good artist, architect, they know their stuff, they know their work. You can't be a writer if you haven't read.
So was Harold Bloom one of the starting points for you?
No. My really starting point was that I really was intrigued by the art historical formalist legacy at Yale. Fosilian. There were many starting points. I did a long time ago this exhibition on Eero Saarinen, and I show you one picture here, which is very telling. And I start with that story where Eero Saarinen, he was accused for plagiarizing, the arch from was it Piacentini, and the fascist monument to the 20th century of Italian fascism, which was of course really bad news, because if you think that an American
you don't want to be taking from that.
No, you don't want to be. And the answer was that even Saarinen's answer and the jury's answer was that fascists didn't invent the arch. There's always been arches, that it's again perennial problem, that my arch is just one of the series. And then Saarinen, this is clearly done for press purposes, this is before he died. He shows that these are the arches that he studied, and he used, of course, in his arch new technologies, but nevertheless it was a solution to the perennial problem of the arch. So, that was also one kind of intriguing, this image kind of stayed with me, that, this is a very, very clear demonstration of a kind of interesting argument. And this is the argument that George Kubler, the famous art historian, who wrote the book The Shape of Time, put forward again, that how forms travel through space and time, and how every work is part of the series, And he was very influential for many contemporary artists, in the 60s, like Robert Smithson, they all read him. So this is also Saarinen traveling, in his 20s, giving, he gave, there are many of these plates, but he kind of studied historical styles and sent these as letters to his friends, he kind of had this sort of history lesson. So that was one of the starting points. And I also love this sort of mid-century interiors, which has all sorts of things from different periods, There's Albert, there's something, he had all this stuff from, African masks.
But it's interesting that Yale and New Haven seem to be like an important reference point in this story. Even for me, who have studied a similar thing, started from this Irish architect, I arrive here somehow, and I arrive here, and there is something about this place that is it's a territory to explore when we're talking about influence. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's again like I chose this because this is kind of my stuff, and I kind of wanted to figure out, because when I came to Yale, I was very mesmerized that everybody was talking about memory and presence of the past. I was like, what the hell, why are they so preoccupied? Because I was, educated maybe misleadingly in a kind of not thinking that, anyway, I was young and ignorant.
Do you think like modernist tradition, or?
Well, I was working in, in Austria, and they of course kind of tried to get rid of the past for the reasons that, have to do with the Second World War, and so it was kind of this avant-garde, moment, when I was there. But this is of course not the only place. This sort of, it's kind of like maybe it just had this sort of perfect storm because of the art historical formalism, and with this, philosopher, for example. But it's not the only place. But America, maybe, there is a kind of, I talk about it all in the introduction, but there was a moment in American history, and if you, like in the 20s, in the late teens, where there was really, like on so many occasions in human history, that the world was going on in the wrong direction. And there was something what could be called kind of a little bit an anti-modernism, even the sense that architecture was taken over by developers. We can relate to that, So they started to talk also, about that, architecture students should have a kind of bigger, should not become a victim of, an architecture should become a victim of external forces, economic forces, but should raise to a kind of higher standard, and they talked about timeless values. And in order to understand the timeless values, there was this argument, and that's where my book begins. They started to introduce history teaching into architecture schools, saying that the students should really understand the bigger picture, like what creates kind of these higher values, these higher standards, this timelessness in architecture. And that in order to achieve that, they have to study history. So this is kind of the turning point, And then there was a kind of even more general sense in America. There's a wonderful book called American Discovery of Tradition, you know. At that same time when Americans became very interested in history, I mean, there was a lot of investment in museums, again kind of sponsored by this sort of very rapid modernization, which kind of made people pause and think about, you know, history, where they came from. So all this sort of, you know, the value of history, you know, more generally was widely discussed. Again, you know, with the sense, and then, you know, the story kind of continue. Like I said, it's not really an anti-modernist story, mind, because they really kind of believe that, you know, even if you're a contemporary architect, you have to engage the past. But there was, you know, there were very strong moments. Also, I talk about Hannah Arendt, who was, you know, came here many occasions to lecture. Again, kind of voicing concern that there's a kind of, I use the word temporal disorientation, you know, where you kind of feel like, you know, after the war, Second World War, that the past is pretty terrible and the future looks very bleak, you know. So this sort of sense of like, where do we stand vis-a-vis time? It wasn't all kind of gung-ho about the future and, you know, progress and so forth. There were a lot of second thoughts and doubts regarding, you know, where the world was heading and where architecture was heading. And I think we can sympathize with that, you know, now with looking at what's happened. I mean, this rate of construction, and you look at, I think, 95%, 99% is pure shit, you know, we know that, you know. So you can, you know, this sort of conversation about values with standards.
There's something about New Haven. I mean, I just arrived, and I must say, I felt a bit like, what is this place?
I know, because it was in the 60s. New Haven was called the modern city. So, you know, the highways come through. This is 59. There was a sense.
And there's like a sequence of modernist buildings just
so
as you go from the station.
So Yale is kind of an island in a city that really in the 60s they just tore down stuff. There was no value attached to the old neighborhoods. Of course, it was partly very racist. You know, they kind of slum clearance, what was called urban renewal. So that's when they basically raised. And you know, Yale is kind of this sort of weird. And that's kind of one thing that sponsored me, that you have these sort of different temporalities existing in side by side. Absolutely. On one hand, there's this rapid modernization, cars, you know, these new freestanding buildings, and then you have this campus, which was built, by the way, 20s and 30s. You know, this is very new. I mean, it's less than 100 years old. But nevertheless, there's this sort of pedestrian urbanism, and even people like, you know, Paul Rudolph, he actually looked at, you know, the Gothic stuff, and he said, this is much better than what's happening over there. You know, there was a lot of concern particularly about American modern urbanism. Paul Rudolph said, you know, architecture had never been in. When he became a dean in '57, he gave a first lecture to the students, saying, modern architecture has never been in a worse state than today. And basically, like, everybody should just go to Rome. It's much more pleasant, you know, this sort of nostalgia for European historical urbanism. So this was kind of the conversation that also, I mean, if you think of it from today's perspective, when we think of like the masterpieces of modern architecture, this was also like really, it was like a fringe phenomena. What was happening in America on steroids was this large-scale urbanization, suburbanization, highways, and soon people just said, this is not good, you know. There was nothing to celebrate in that, you know. So of course, I mean, it was also backlash, you know, for, you know, architecture that had been totally taken over by also commerce, by development. And there were no values. So when we talk about modernist architecture, I mean, of the early 20th, I mean, we are talking a fringe. This is fringe. It's only after the 20th century that then it goes. But in America, that sort of commercialization, I mean, kind of developer architecture, started to exist. It doesn't look like oftentimes like, you know, modernist,
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. Yeah,
but it was modern in the sense that it was very developer driven, commercially driven, and people didn't like it, you know. But this is actually, this would be interesting. I've seen this drawing by Louis Kahn many times over, and I never, it's, you know, the main second, the whole
in the British school, British
art, yeah, so
Center for
this
British
is now round, but this is early sketch. But I never paid attention, you know, this has now the animals of stubs on the walls. But what does Kahn put on the wall? Look.
Yeah, the paint.
What is on the paintings? What does he?
Architecture, right?
Yeah. What type of architecture?
Yeah, classical.
Yeah. Well, not classic. I mean, not classic.
Interior.
Well, like for example, this is you know, this.
Oh,
one.
that's that. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, I see.
So I mean, he's like I mean, he was good friends with Saarinen, like Saarinen in the picture that I showed. He said, "This is what I've been looking at," and you look at this, you look at this, and you look at that. You know, so they were all, you know, very. It wasn't even hiding the influences, but they were very adamant that this is what. Yeah, this is actually the guy Paul Weiss that was a very influential. Said Weiss lectured on philosophy. I mean, again, like this was a superstar philosopher, kind of forgotten nowadays. Weiss lectures on philosophy, architecture, as artist understanding of past, future. So this sort of engagement with time and with temporal change. So not totally. Anyway, that's kind of the crux of the argument. So,
and maybe I just want to just talk a little bit more about New Haven, and of course there's all this architecture that you say it's built like Gothic looking architecture that was built, I guess, beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah. Late. I mean, starting 22.
20. Yeah. Okay.
22. Yeah.
And which is also shown in the
that's the library.
The cover. And then we have these masterpieces. I don't know how we would describe the architecture stylistically. How we would describe this building and the two Kahn buildings and various other.
Well, they were two kind of.
I just wonder what do they do to the teaching of architecture? What do they do to like a culture of the place?
Well, I mean, they are totally, I think, integral. I think Yale has a very urban campus, you know, created in the 20th century. And two moments. There was the moment in the 20s and 30s with the, you know, massive master plan. It was really I mean, they bought properties and basically erased everything and created this new uniform urban neo-Gothic campus, which urbanistically is wonderful. I mean, you know, you have streets and building, you know, streets lined up with buildings and these amazing super blocks with courtyards. It's urbanistically quite wonderful, you know. And then the second moment, which is also important, the second moment, so Yale had kind of a reputation that it was kind of old-fashioned. It was a school that was traditionally really catering to very wealthy families. Actually, our dean once said to me, you know, smart people went to Harvard at that time, but people from right families came to Yale. So it was a little bit snobby, old-fashioned. So then there was this new president at the turn of the century in the 50s, and he really wanted to, quote-unquote, modernize Yale. He was, you know, on the cover of Time magazine and was very progressive, also educationally, really a pioneer. Wrote a lot about the humanities education. His name was Whitney Griswold. And he did something quite remarkable. He hired a lot of these, you know, top architects of the era. And instead of erasing, again, what had come before, I mean, these Gothic buildings were then only 20 years old, so you have to understand that it was kind of weird, you know. So he made the buildings, and this was really, if you think of what was happening in American urbanism at that time, you had this freestanding modernist building, the street was gone. So he really made architects to work within the urban fabric and create urban buildings. Paul Rudolph wonderfully writes about that buildings have to be, modern buildings have to be good neighbors. The kind of beginning of contextualism. Saarinen, when he designed the dome, he also adapted it to the Yale campus. So this sort of idea of contextualism, that you don't just erase everything from the past like they were doing, you know, in the rest of the city, but creating urban buildings that adjust to the, you know, the buildings from a different era. This was very significant, you know, and you can see the museums. I mean, I always say to students, go and look how they solved the entrances. I mean, these 3 buildings, you know, our building, the museum, wonderful entrances. You can tell the campus is full of wonderful entrances.
And of course, the Centre for British Art almost bring street kind of in and the art gallery corner. Also from, you know, creating that setback and the stair. And we have this big, you know, big stair, you know, from the York Street. So, you know, they are magnificent buildings, and I think we certainly I use them. I just yesterday we reviewed work by my freshman undergraduates who are basically 18 years old, wonderful people. And they made, you know, I asked them to choose a building at Yale and either do a paper, do an analytical model, or a set of drawings. This is actually one of the students did the Beinecke, which is wonderful. I mean, these are people who don't have studio space. They, you know, made these. I mean, this is a guy who has never done models except for this class. So it's amazing. You know, he was interested in the building, how it appears kind of solid, but then it's actually very thin, you know, the facade and the light, he photographed it, you know. But anyway, but this is also like the wonderful stair, you know. So, no, it's amazing to be able to, I mean, Yale has probably, even at the time they were building these mid-century buildings, somebody at Columbia was not doing the same, they said Yale has the best. It's like basically it actually used the word that it's a de facto museum for contemporary architecture, that it has collected this, and people come from all over the world to visit us. So of course it's amazing, you know. So I was talking to a wonderful co-head of history and theory at the AA the other day, and
who is that?
It's called Nick Simsik. He's a young academic, and he recently joined. He studied at the AA, and he understands the world of academia very well, which is good to have someone like that at the AA. And he was saying, and I was asking him about Yale, and he said that people from Yale have an affinity towards the AA, and that AA people, when in the American context, they have affinity towards Yale. And there is something, and when I entered the building, EEVA, I immediately felt, I mean, it's a dramatically different building to the AA. But I felt there was something about the scale, there was something about the texture, there's something, there's something domestic.
No, it's really a kind of a familiar atmosphere. I mean, I just completed my 30th year, so because I was hired so young, and I've been here ever since, kind of raising the academic ranks, you know, to a full professor. And I mean, I feel very, I mean, it's my life, my school of my life. I mean, I love the students. I teach, you know, now undergraduate, I mean, the Yale undergraduate, they could do anything. They are so smart and so enthusiastic, and masters and PhD students. I teach kind of across the programs we have. But I think we are wonderful. We also, I think we are small. We are smaller than Harvard. We are Columbia. I often laugh that because they are not as well endowed, so they take students, you know, our students all have desk space. They have 2 desks, you know. We give them computers. in a way they get much more for their money.
I mean, that's amazing.
But they have to, Columbia has to take, because it's like
it relies
paying
on
customers.
fees. Yeah.
And there's something about, I mean, I did my dissertation at Columbia. I commuted because I was already here. They didn't have funding at that time, and I had, you know, kind of met my husband. I didn't really want to move. I knew that this is my place long term. But you know, because it's so big and people live far away and there's not really a scene. People are kind of like, whatever it's worth, kind of trapped here. So it feels like you are really here, you know, and you feel like you're kind of immersed in this academic culture. Everybody lives pretty close by. And our school is also like smaller, so I think it's big enough to have a lively culture, but it's small enough that, you know, the dean would know everybody's name, and everybody greets, and you know, we have every Thursday we have lectures and then big reception afterwards where you talk with students. We also, I think, more like I would say like we are a design school. Like I would say, we of course have history theory, we have a PhD program, but we don't have like landscape, we don't have preservation, we don't all these other programs. We are really, you know, we're kind of focused on design, and everything kind of supports that endeavor. So in a way it makes kind of like everybody's having the same conversation, you know. The students are fantastic, and like I said, everybody has a desk in the building, so this is kind of, I don't know, Dean Burke actually, when she came, it was kind of nice. I hate to do the gender thing, but you know, woman's touch that she provided students, because they spend so much time in the building, a kitchen, you know, that they can
kind of makes sense.
Make at least eat their own food, and you know, we have a faculty lounge. No, it has a kind of you're absolutely right. It has and Yale on the whole, it's just like, for example, I mean, just again to this sort of economy of scale. All the PhD programs at Yale are fully funded. You know, Columbia is like, you have art history students and then they have a master's program that funds the PhD program. We don't do that. There are no master's program in complete or art history or English. They just, you know, they take the PhD students, they are fully funded. And so the numbers are smaller. So it's really also the cross-fertilization that, you know, our students take classes all over the university, which creates also, you know, enables this sort of interdisciplinary conversation.
I guess, on the other hand, it is removed, so it is a university town.
Yeah.
So it's not like, let's say, maybe we could talk a little bit about practice of architecture, because I guess practice is based in New York. Practice in kind of in its full intensity is not. Even in Boston, there aren't many, I'd say, well-known or like good architectural practices.
So this has, of course, a little bit. Well, most of my colleagues, for that reason, live in New York. Our dean lives in New York. Has the practice. Bob Stern had also a practice in New York, but now there's still one big office, the Caesar Pelli, you know. You know, I mean, they are.
No.
You don't know Caesar Pelli?
No.
It's kind of funny so Caesar Pelli, I think it has shrunk a little bit, but it's now called Pelli Clark Pelli. Caesar Pelli was our former dean, who has a very successful office. You know, I just give you one example. Petronas Towers in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. That's Caesar Pelli.
Oh, right.
You know, so there's probably, you've been to a city with, you know, whether it's Hong Kong, London, the new Shell headquarters in Amsterdam. I mean, these people are like, they might not be the Rem Koolhaases, but they do this. They are so successful in design office, and when they actually one very nice building is the new Salesforce headquarters in San Francisco. But they say when they compete for commissions, they don't compete with people like Rem Koolhaas. Rem Koolhaas has no skills, the office, to do these large-scale commercial projects. So they compete with HOK, SOM, Forster, Norman Forster, Caesar Pelli, and then there was maybe one more.
KPFs and
KPF, yeah. So this is like the
but that's the level, yeah.
That's, you know, so it's interesting also because our kind of architecture world is so skewed to this sort of small avant-garde practices, but then these offices that really kind of rule the game. I remember there was once we had a situation, we went out for dinner.
And they're based in New Haven?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And they have the son, the second, I mean, Caesar Pelli died a few years ago, but the son has an arm of the office in New York, but they are kind of design office, they don't do the working drawings. But anyway, they do like, I mean, whether it's skyscrapers.
But I think that those kind of practices, I think you can find in big cities. But I mean,
but they are here, and the reason they are here also, like they said, of course, the founder was a dean, so that's how it started. But of course, I mean, real estate is so much cheaper here. And the other one was Kevin Roche. And that office, of course, folded 5 years ago when he died. But, you know, it was, I mean, Kevin won the Pritzker Prize. So, I mean, this was a very big office. And Kevin said that they flew clients to New Haven with the helicopter.
Yeah.
You know, there was nothing in that, because I did a project on him too. There was nothing in the ledger that was under $100 million in the 60s. So you multiply it with they did so big projects. And the office had, I think at its peak, like 150 people. So it used to have, so Pelli still exists and they employ. I think the office it's not super big, but if I say 100 people, they don't do working drawings because they have a very diverse portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I understand, but for example, I mean, if you compare it to London, I mean, of course, London is the only, like, I think in the story of America is that it's dispersed, right? That you have centers on the East Coast, West Coast. I think London is unique in a way that everything is in London, which is also its own.
Well, it's a metropolis.
It's a metropolis.
New Haven has 150,000 people. So.
Yeah, but I think absolutely. I think I'm kind of thinking about it in context of like architectural education and schools of architecture that are in close proximity to practice. So I mean, our students, of course. I mean, there are some nice small offices. There's another office that was a kind of the couple offices that were splinter offices from the Pelli. You know, there's actually the guy who was in charge of the Petronas Towers. Is now also kind of big office in town. They do this type of, you know, like this is not, you know, this sort of skyscraper stuff, but of course the vicinity of New York, you know, most of our graduates go to, you know, you know, whether it's in the summers. I mean, the summers there we have a building project after the first year, second year they spend 5 years in kind of abroad in a kind of summer program. But nevertheless, I mean, I would say 50% of our students go to New York straight, you know, beeline to New York after graduation. And, you know, when we have our college, we have always this sort of, what do you call it, recruiting fair. It's the New York firms, you know, suck up our graduates. Yes, all of your graduates. I mean, I think part of my research, which was to do with this idea of, let's call it influence, even though I totally agree with you that the term is, I guess, so broad and it's on one hand broad and on the other hand is quite specific. But I think one thing that in the context of, let's say, Ireland, something that I thought was quite interesting is the fact that it requires this physical journey. So all Irish architects, and it's a Joycean thing as well, that the character in Joyce always has to go away, you know, go see Paris, go see London. And there's something about this geographical, physical journey that a character or an architect needs to take. to go and learn and then come back. And so Shane de Blackham, who's the architect that I told you about, he came to America.
Yeah.
He worked for Kahn, he went back. Most of his students also went to London, went to America and went back. And so there's something about this kind of physical journey, and you yourself made this physical journey from Europe to America. Yeah. So I don't know, is there something about this that you think it's kind of central to
I think all architects,
the culture of the profession?
I mean, Le Corbusier traveled, you know, of course, famously to study historical architecture, you know, the voyage to the Orient, you know. Alvar Aalto traveled, you know, the misconception, I mean, I wrote a book about Aalto, the misconception of where I wanted to dismantle the misconception that Aalto was kind of stuck in the woods. I mean, he was on the road. He spoke 7 languages, you know. He was always on the road, you know. You wonder when he had time to work. So all of them, I mean, Paul Rudolph to Rome, Louis Kahn to Rome. I mean, so no matter where you are, I think the people who really develop, I mean, they have the curiosity, you know. And of course, like Aalto was also very networked. I mean, he knew exactly. And it's funny because the misconception is that he would be with somebody like Hugo Haring. No way, Jose. I mean, he was with Gideon and Gropius and Laszlo those were his best friends. The powerful, you know.
Right.
So this, I mean, you know, whether it's being so the influence is kind of misconstrued, because first of all it always kind of suggests this sort of one-way road, you know, and usually it kind of is reduced to being part of, you know, kind of one-to-one influence, whether it's a, you know, mentor or teacher or. But I think we absorb things in a more kind of diffuse way also. I mean, look at of course, one thing that happened also at this time that I observed was that, you know, like the first time they really could do like print magazine, Cahiers d'Art was the first one, kind of a print magazine, you know, so this was also new technology. So the ability to, you know, print and disseminate images, of course, something that
of certain quality and
this is also something new. And then you start to have things like I have this image of a magazine that Paul Rudolph published, where he compares all sorts of fun things, you know, totally kind of randomly. Where is it? You know, reading magazines. I mean, Aalto subscribed to some I counted them was like 30 magazines from abroad, you know. This is an image from article that Paul Rudolph wrote, where these are funny categories. He said relationship of buildings to the sky. And look at, he just compares, you know, there's no dates, you know, he said there's a Hagia Sophia, there's a Parthenon, you know, there's all sorts of buildings. And he just said, I'm looking at all this stuff, you know. Something from China. So this proliferation of images also is another, like, what you call this influence. I mean, of course, I mean, it's kind of like you just suck up and absorb everything you see through travel, through reading. Of course, working, I was very influenced by a guy I worked with in Austria, certainly because I was, you know, it was an apprenticeship. I mean, somebody who said, you work with somebody closely, you know, basically I learned.
I mean, that's another
so
characteristic.
There are different modalities of.
I mean, that's another characteristic of the profession, that at some point every architect would have worked for another architect.
Correct. Yeah.
At some point in their life, right?
So there are different modalities of influence. I mean, that's of course a very strong influence. So it's sometimes like none of the people in my architecture school in Tampere, Finland, were influential. I was much more influenced by my best friend, who actually happened to study in AA for 1 year and came back with tons of books and gave me desk grids, which was not the custom in Finland at that time. Okay. So I was much more influenced by her and her husband, actually, who is a very successful architect, a partner in Alice Morrison.
Now, current.
Christopher Beerman. So, you know, sometimes the influences and, you know, I worked with several architects, but the guy in Austria had biggest impact on me. When I came to Yale, I had a magnificent teacher, Karsten Harris, my master's thesis advisor, super influential, you know. So there are many people who are influential. My husband has been very influential. So, you know, influence kind of, there's a, like I said, it happens in different modalities, you know. Travels, you know,
and it's constant, right?
It's constant.
Yeah, it never
so
stops.
it's like just limiting. But like I said, it's, you know, this sort of engagement with buildings that came before architects. Of course, we all study. I mean, now we take it for granted, but like what is interesting, the decision to study that architectural history is now, for example, required. I don't know the you know, in American architecture schools, accredited architecture schools, is totally significant. You know, that it's a requirement of professional training. We can't take it for granted. You know, it didn't used to be. I mean, when architecture at Yale was taught in the Polytechnic, there was a kind of Polytechnic. It was not so. So all these things are kind of like, even officially say, like, you know, I don't know how it works actually in Europe, but here schools are accredited every 5 years.
5 years,
yeah,
similar to the UK.
Yeah, so we have to, you know, show what we teach them historically. You know, of course, in Bauhaus they didn't teach. You know, Bauhaus, they didn't really teach architecture. It was a craft school, you know, and craft has a different relationship to the past, because of course we are, you know, like whether you do weaving or woodwork, I mean, there's kind of organic relationship to the past. Nobody invents weaving every day, you know. Nobody invents woodwork every day. It's kind of a part of, you know, again, the apprenticeship system.
But so it's profoundly linked. It comes from the past. It comes
from the material practice. So even that had I mean, you didn't learn history through books. You learned it just through the practice, you know. So I don't know, I just want to kind of like, I mean, this book was really kind of broadening my own sense in these terms, that this is just business as usual. It's not like what postmodernist, you know. And of course, you know, most of all the modern masters, actually in America, Yale, you had a Beaux-Arts, people had Beaux-Arts training till the 40s, you know. So all these people, whether it's Saarinen or Kahn, they learned Beaux-Arts. Also Aalto, that's what they learned, you know, classicism, you know.
But so do you feel like postmodernism was a missed opportunity in some ways, or? No,
I mean, postmodern, I find it kind of, I actually end just before.
I wonder. That's why I wonder.
Well, like I talk about Venturi, who is of complexity and contradiction, is super interesting in and important for my discussion, but it's just, again, those terms are so misused and misunderstood, you know, that it's kind of like deconstruction in architecture. It's so meaningless that it's like beyond the point, you know.
But postmodernism is a little bit more, I guess, articulate than deconstruction in a kind of formal sense.
Where, you know, again, where do you? It's interesting because one of the, I think, great rereadings of Aalto was Dimitri Porphyrio's dissertation on Aalto, The Sources of Modern Eclecticism, you know, and he looks at Aalto through, I mean, kind of through the postmodern lens, that, you know, saying that he actually was, you know, able to have these different, I mean, he combined vernacular with, you know, with you know, kind of that high modernist, you know, flat roof, wide way, and he just, you know, it's totally organic. He did a little bit, you know, Jugendstil, that sort of interest in nature and the organic form, and kind of flirting even with kind of little bit ornamentation in that and decoration with that. So eclecticism, you know, and he just, I mean, it was a kind of example that he almost kind of puts Aalto in that sort of quote-unquote postmodern frame, kind of showing that this is not anything new. I mean, if you look at, so I think postmodern more, I'm less interested in the architecture that bears the label postmodern, you know, let's say, I don't know, name one?
Terry Farrell.
Terry Farrell, yeah. So I mean, but I'm just more interested in that it opened eyes for this new generation of architects like Dimitri Porphyriou to look at the modernist heritage, with the more open eyes, not by saying, or like let's say the revisionist take on Mies van der Rohe, that he was actually, you look at the early work and you're kind of, he was interested in Schinkel, and that's where it all kind of came from. So I think I like that those American postmodern, somebody like Philip Johnson's AT&T, I think they are totally uninteresting buildings, But this sort of new way of looking at, again, rewriting, rereading 20th century architecture through that more open eyes,
And then, of course, you're here for, you said, past 30 years, educating contemporary architects that are going to come into the world and practice. And so, so if we skip through from postmodernism to, let's say, this kind of deconstruction or whatever, to the kind of the tendencies that are now present, how do you create a clear perspective, or how do you create a perspective towards what's happening now? As a historian, I guess you need a bit of a distance to that subject matter, but you're also clearly observing things that are unfolding in front of your eyes. And
one kind of, I don't know, again, I don't want to pass moral judgment, but one kind of phenomena what's happening now with students is that they the way that they use images, they design. I mean, they have constantly, Arc Daily or Instagram.
The zine is quite
the zine.
bad.
They like if you think of like 60, somebody like Paul Rudolph in the 50s, looking at doing this sort of image saturated articles, I mean, this is now like exponentially so that they are just surrounded by images. They live in this sort of fluid visual culture. They don't think of dates, it's just kind of like anything that I can use. I mean, that's the usable past, moment. So so this is kind of the world that they exist. So I'm kind of reading like, okay, it's in what it's totally continuous with what I'm interested in this, but kind of like exponentially so. And this is, I read this article, I don't know, have you ever read Atlantic? There's a magazine. Yeah. So there was a very good article just today, or last night I read about algorithms, how, I mean, it was kind of like that, how it flattens culture, that, whether it's Spotify or even design, Instagram and fashion, that everything kind of like operates on algorithms. And
extremely fast.
Fast, yeah. And if you look at some of the now, like my pet peeve is this sort of infatuation with mid-century modernism. Like also some of the visiting I mean, everybody looks it all looks the same, and everything is this sort of little bit modern, kind of mid-century, pseudo-modern, contemporary. It all looks the same. And there is a kind of... And
what do you mean all? What you mean, just references or architecture that's being...
I'm just kind of wondering the argument that this sort of, the image culture is now so algorithm based. Like if you go to computer and you... Yes. It's funny because once I actually, because I was giving some talk related to that, but I Googled, because like when we use the word modern, and then I Googled like modern architecture, and then you get these images like contemporary buildings. They all look alike, They have kind of like, especially like the modern house. They all look a little bit kind of mid-century modernist kind of, but it is kind of like architecture that's kind of designed by algorithm, It all has that little bit wood, a lot of glass, a lot of.
I mean, there's something comforting and soothing.
But it's kind of like, it's kind of so bland.
Yes.
So, that everything. So
it's appealing, and it's appealing to a wide. It's a bit like, I think it's starting to become.
It's a common
Yes, it's a bit like fashion.
Yeah.
It's entering into this realm of fashion.
Yeah. It's kind of like the H and M of architecture design. So that's a little bit depressing.
But then what's interesting is that architecture takes 10 years to build a building. So even though there is a fashion sensibility towards fashion and speed, it takes so much longer to build a building.
Yeah.
And I think there is something strange. There is some weird kind of disjunction in this, in our profession, between the image culture and the kind of production of space.
But it's like when I went to Graz, Austria in '88 to work with this architect Volker Kinke, there was this thing called Graz Schule. That there was this exhibition, and the catalogue was kind of widely circulated. It was kind of a place with a kind of something distinct, And Barcelona was another place at that time. I mean, Finland was a place in the 50s. Kind of like everybody was into that 50s moment, and those sort of moments, like it's kind of. I mean, again, I don't want to come across as some sort of nostalgic, but I think those days are gone, and it was kind of wonderful. I mean, like being at Graz, for example, which was a kind of defining moment it was amazing.
I guess you also talk about exhibition in your career. You've also written about the importance of exhibitions, and that's maybe something that counters the image culture is a space you have to go to. You need to engage. You need to spend time. You need to.
But now also exhibitions also, because when I was doing the book, it was really when you get to 90s. I kind of end, I think, with 2000, but it was really hard to find any longer kind of exhibition moments that really made a splash. Now we have so many biennales and triennales. I learned about some new one in Abu Dhabi or somewhere. I mean, you can't tell one thing from another. It's all the same people, same. And schools also, like, I had this sort of, this was kind of the Yale moment, with all these amazing people coming through. And now, of course, it's the same people circulating everywhere, So it's harder to, it's kind of like AA also. I mean, when I studied architecture in the 80s in Finland, AA was like, I remember there was the exhibitions. I remember there was an exhibition of MacDonald and Salter. Mary Miss, there was an exhibition.
There was
and the catalogue,
a wonderful catalogue.
Yeah, and I have some of the catalogues. But now AA is also kind of like, it's just like everything is kind of the same.
Well, I think one thing that I think in some way AA is able to continue to be quite, I mean, in terms of the program, the kind of public offering. I agree with you. There is a kind of certain flatness because we can print, we can make an exhibition in 2 days, we can plonk
and the same tools.
Same tools. But I think one thing that I think distinguishes the AA is the freedom that academics there can have in respect of regulators. I mean, the program that I teach there, I don't think I could teach anywhere in the world.
No, and I don't need despairingly, but I mean, you could say the same thing about I was once. It's a while ago. I was in a jury for a competition. It was kind of ideas competition in New York, in the what is it called? It's where the old harbor is. And the entries came from all over the world, and everything looks the same because of the software, But anyway, the schools are a little bit the same.
And probably also because of the image circulation.
So it has become. I mean, the world has become more flat in the sense, Of course, that doesn't mean that one couldn't achieve great designs, and of course there's a benefit to that sort of sharing of information.
And do you think that there is some merit in architectural education maybe becoming closer to, let's say, art education, or it has already done so? But
I don't know enough about it to comment, but I mean my personal crusade has always been kind of built on the humanist tradition. I mean, we deal with humans, you know. We create spaces for humans. Of course, we can also create spaces for non-human species and think about, you know, humans in the context of wider ecologies. But nevertheless, our real client is the human being, and of course, artists, you know, they think about those differently. So I think that's kind of the bottom line, you know. I actually, it's interesting because I often get really bothered when it's now like we talk about black bodies, and I'm like, they're not bodies, they are like human beings, you know. For God's sakes, they have to appropriate the language of the oppressors, but human beings, and I think I really believe in that kind of tradition of architecture that runs, you know, from, I guess, from the Renaissance to you know, through 20th century certainly, and I think it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, you know.
Maybe I just want one last question.
Yeah.
I think you need to go. It's 1:08 to 2.
Yeah.
But just one final thing, maybe on reflection, maybe whether there's other mediums or media that architecture could learn from, or could understand certain tactics in order to.
Or from different. Actually, yeah. So now I understand. So I do believe also, I mean, this is again like something that I have hold on to in my teaching, is that it's transmedial. You know, that we architects work very well across media. So I teach actually a class called Space, Time and Form, and it's kind of like riffing on Bauhaus, but we do, you know, we do everything from typography to weaving to you know, photography and so forth. And the students, you know, like, I think we can learn techniques. We can you know, transfer techniques across media. We can also transfer concepts across media. I mean, like, let's say the concept weaving, you know, that we weave, you know, let's say
it's
landscape into, or we weave landscape and, you know, build, you know, that it's, so I do believe that it can enrich, you know.
And time, you mentioned time a lot. And there are these shapes of time there. And you know, I work, for example, with film, so we teach a lot through
film.
Film
is another example. Also, like, you know, the kind of pushing back against some of the limitations of architecture, like the film is typical. Like, how can, you know, architecture engage time, or, you know, movement?
Because it does. I guess it does. It's just, I think what film allows, it captures it, and it allows this kind of creation of space that really is almost, it's in your mind, but it's space, and it's architecture, and it's ephemeral, but it's there. And so there is something really beautiful in that.
And we recently also, like, I've been, Yale has actually a small dance program. And there's I mean, not the undergraduate, and I befriend the people who teach in that program. So in my courses, we often have a dance workshop, because dancers think a lot about space, you know, much more than. And if you look at, I mean, I'm kind of also like another thing that I hold into, that architecture is really an art of space, you know, space making. And sometimes you wonder, if you look at like artists, again, like back to your question about this art and architecture relationship, like somebody like Olafur Eliasson. I mean, he really thinks about space, he thinks about experience, you know. And sometimes architects talk less about, you know.
Yes, they enter the realm of an artist. They talk about personal impressions or his.
No, it's wonderful. Yeah. No, his work is, I think, and you can tell that the students is very influential.
He's influential, incredibly, on architectural education.
And one other word that kind of maybe resonates with art, well, just an idea of experience. Ideas about experience, creativity, again, kind of particular maybe properties and capacities of human mind and human, soul that can be brought to the fore. So I often say the only place, sometimes we kind of architects overlook those sort of things that I think, used to be also the mainstream of the conversation: imagination, creativity, experience. That's where I like the 50s moment. That's where our next project is going
because it's there, it's so tangible.
Yeah. But I actually laughed to my student. I said the only place they talk about creativity on Yale campus is the School of Business, or the School of Management.
That's so true.
Yeah. And here it's like we don't like. It's kind of becomes so rational, and anyway. But I kind of want to bring back that sort of thing in my own teaching.
Absolutely, I think there is such. Creativity.
And it's in the research.
Or valuing creativity, valuing a kind of innovation. And I think it's also a question. It goes back to this idea of influence. It's actually Harold Bloom probably talks a little bit about innovation. It's like to be innovative, you actually have to understand the past, but you also need to actively misread it.
That's very, very, very powerful. And I think the one thing that really is also, I feel like we've gone through such dark times, and in America also, and I think continue to do so. Whether it's the George Floyd moment and the pandemic and these endless wars. And I think there is a kind of a desire to revisit, what makes humans human, and positive, this sort of acknowledging the human agency to create change, to create experiences. And I can tell the students, because there was a moment, very dark moment in also the architecture school where everything was so negative, everything was decolonized, this kind of darkness. And I think we can be at the same time really aware of these problems, systematic problems, societal problems, but at the same time think architecture as a kind of gift and a source of positive
joy.
Change.
Well, it goes back to this idea of craft.
Yeah.
Somehow craft is always joyful.
Joyful, yeah. No,
craft is something you're giving your love. You're putting your love into this object. I think that's like a premise of craft.
Craft, yeah. No, I totally agree, and that's I don't know. These are the kind of ideas that I'm interested in at the moment to explore. I don't want dark. I can't wake up in the morning in the darkness. And I think it's interesting why, because I sometimes feel like, this sort of idea of criticality, like that you can't be positive. You have to be kind of negative, almost to the sense of paralysis, Like there's also this anti-architecture moment,